John Kerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
As you know, Democrats got pasted in the governor's races in Virginia and New Jersey this week. You know how this place works and how politicians get spooked by election results. How is that going to affect the way some of your Democratic colleagues, especially the moderates and conservatives, behave on issues like health care, climate change, Afghanistan?
I don't think it's going to change their approach. Healthcare has a life of its own. People are looking for the best way to lower the costs and provide people with quality care. That doesn't change because of the election. And I think people have been intent, having worked on this on the Finance Committee, I'm confident of it, have been intent on succeeding. So it's the outcome we're looking for, not the politics.
Aren't some of these blue dogs, though, going to say, wait a minute, spending, big government, Washington's not popular, I can't go there?
Well, this is a bill, this bill, we have been absolutely fixated on making it deficit neutral. And it's at CBO right now. The reason it's being delayed is we're waiting for the numbers. We're legislating in a remarkably responsible way, not always the history here in Washington. So I think people are going to be guided by the guarantee that they're really going to do what the bill sets out to do: lower the cost, provide quality care, improve the system. I think those will be the tests.
The reality of this election season and probably next year is 10% unemployment. What should the Congress do about that beyond what you guys have already done?
Well, our ability to do a great deal about it beyond what we've already done is limited. I mean, we can't continue to pile a deficit, into infinity, and we have a serious fiscal challenge facing us now.
So no new jobs tax credit?
No, I think what you'll see is, first of all, the energy, the bill that we've put together to deal with energy and climate is in fact a jobs bill, a very significant jobs bill. It's going to have a profound impact on America's economy. It's going to excite major new investment. It's going to result in jobs being created in America and kept in America. And I'm very excited about it for that reason. I think it is a stimulus package, in effect. So that's going to have a huge impact next year. And all the indicators are coming back from almost every analysis that this provides investment money into states and creates jobs in states all across our country. So people really need to step back and get away from the quick hit political slogans that have been used to define this legislation and look at its true impact. It's one of the reasons the Chamber of Commerce changed its view the other day and said, indeed, we've got to do this Congress. And what they want to make sure is that we do it in a reasonable and smart way.
Well, so does that mean that you think this idea of some sort of a new job creation tax credit that Speaker Pelosi's talked about, that President Obama talked about in the campaign, is a non-starter because you can't afford it?
No, I don't think that's a non-starter. I think you could have some targeted, selected efforts. You asked me about a big stimulus package. I say no, I don't think you're going to see that, except to the degree that it is contained in legislation that we need to do for a lot of other reasons too. So I think that, I think that we're already coming out of this. It's a slower growth than some people would like. Employment, unfortunately, always lags behind that kind of recovery. But we are a lot better off. I mean, people really don't know how close we were to the precipice back in January and February when the president became president. He had to make some extraordinary tough decisions up front, early. He did that and really rescued a struggling system. Very early next year, if not at the end of this year, depending on the healthcare debate, we're going to be getting into financial regulatory reform. That will have an impact on fixing the system. And then we get the energy climate piece done, and that creates jobs. I think by the middle of next summer, somewhere, you could begin to see some real progress that people can grab a hold of.
So you think the economy is in better shape than many people now appreciate in terms of the arc of recovery, and that members of Congress, your fellow Democrats, ought to be content to run and make that argument?
I think that, John, that clearly we're in better shape than we were in January or February when we were at the precipice of major failures beyond what we experienced. We have yet distance to go. I don't think any of us are sitting here sanguine that there aren't things we can't do to continue to kick the economy into gear, and that we shouldn't do them. We should. Healthcare is one of them. Healthcare, if we reduce the burden on business and we spread the costs more intelligently throughout our economy, we're going to have a positive impact on that economy. Secondly, if we get the energy independence jobs bill done, that will excite new investment, new jobs in states. I mean, we're already seeing it. The fastest growing sectors of most of our states in the country today is not the traditional economy. It's the alternative energy, renewable energy, efficiency energy economy. And that's where the change is coming. If we can kick that into higher gear, we can, we're looking at a $6 trillion market globally and a $6 billion user market. Compare that to the 1990s when we created unbelievable wealth in America with a $1 trillion market and 1 billion users. So we're looking at an enormous opportunity, and we need to grab it.
You wrote an op-ed column with Lindsey Graham a couple of weeks ago that said, yes, we can pass a bill on climate change. I interviewed your Democratic colleague, Ben Nelson, the other day, and he said, no, we can't. And the reason is that it's going to raise costs for everybody who flips on a light switch. Why is he wrong?
Ben is, respectfully, I like Ben, and I've chatted with him briefly about it, but he's actually wrong about that in terms of the net impact on states and on individuals. Household income actually goes up under that legislation because while the unit price of gas or the unit price of electricity might go up individually, the overall costs of an individual at home in their total consumption will go down because of energy efficiencies, more efficient automobiles, and so forth. So it's too quick a hit just to say costs are going to go up. In fact, the studies by reputable companies like the McKinsey company or other entities in the country, the University of California, Berkeley, various entities have done analyses, show job growth and show a very, very minimal cost increase to families across America. I mean, very minimal.
Even if you're right, in the political culture that we live in, isn't the quick hit that Senator Nelson mentioned the kind of thing that's fatal to a big piece of legislation?
I don't think it will be on this because the imperatives, I mean, that's why Lindsey Graham from South Carolina is saying we have to do this. That's why Joe Lieberman, an independent Democrat who has often been right at the center of some of these debates, is very powerfully committed to saying we need to do this. That's why businesses across the country were dropping out of the Chamber of Commerce.
Why isn't your friend John McCain with you in this effort, by the way? He was supporting cap and trade in the campaign. Is he not a maverick anymore?
Oh, I think John is being very thoughtful about it, and I'm confident that he is going to look at this very closely, what we're doing. We anticipate sharing with him everything we are doing in hopes of bringing him aboard. And I feel confident that John McCain remains deeply committed on this issue. It's been a signature issue for him. I think he sees other people sort of doing their pieces right now, and that's appropriate. But my hope is that at the right time, John McCain will step in and show the leadership that John McCain has the ability to and has many times demonstrated, not only on this issue, but on others.
You've both run for president. You're good friends. You've even entertained the idea of running with him. What's your relationship like with him now?
It's good. John and I, like any two people who are on the opposite sides of the fence on a couple of issues, namely my run for president and his run for president, are inevitably going to find a little friction in that process, and I think it's fair to say we did. But it's also fair to say that we both have much bigger interests. We both traveled beyond that moment, and we both want to be constructive in the United States Senate and have mutual respect for each of our journeys. So I very much, we've sat, we've talked, we're going to work on things, we're going to find things to do together, and I obviously hope very much that this will be one of them.
You mentioned in your op-ed with Lindsey Graham that we should not let countries that don't adhere to environmental standards take jobs from us. And you raised the idea of a tax on imports from countries that don't adhere to those standards. Are you suggesting a tax on imports from China?
I'm suggesting that it is appropriate for any country that has signed up to an international global agreement that we are going to behave in a certain way, that if one or two countries decide to stay outside of that mechanism, of that agreement, and they think they're going to take advantage of our marketplace at the expense of our jobs because we signed up to an international agreement, they ought to be wrong. They are wrong. And I think it is entirely within the international legal standards for countries to set up an enforcement mechanism whereby if countries decide to try to clean our clock in the marketplace by taking advantage of the fact that we're going to do what's responsible and they're not, it's entirely appropriate for us to make it harder for them to sell their products in our market.
Now that sounds like
that is an accepted principle of any kind of global environmental agreement, and I think other countries will welcome and join into that kind of a protocol.
Now that sounds like a warning to China and India, but if China and India stay out of that protocol, doesn't that mean the Copenhagen process isn't going anywhere anyway?
What it means is that it's going to be much more difficult to get a climate agreement here in the United States, and it means that any major country that decides to not come to some kind of an agreement in Copenhagen will bear responsibility conceivably for its failure. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to proceed ahead in some ways because we need to. I mean, look, right now, John, in the United States of America, over half of our economy is already voluntarily under a mandatory reduction scheme. You have 11 to, I think, or 13 states in the northeast of New England who've come together in what's called RGGI, the Regional New England Program to reduce emissions. You have a Midwest program that encompasses about 5 to 7 states. You have a Western program with Oregon, Washington, California, Canada, where they've agreed to reduce emissions. If you add those up, it's over 50% of the American economy is moving way ahead of Washington, D.C. Washington politicians are behind the private sector, behind businesses, and behind over 1,000 mayors in America who have signed on to the Mayor's Conference emissions reduction proposal. So Washington is truly not even following on this yet, and we have a long way to go to catch up.
Well, speaking of that, word on the street is that because Washington's behind and because we'll take a lot of flack at Copenhagen, that President Obama will not go. Is that the right course?
Well, I hope that's not accurate. No, I don't think it's the right course for the president.
You think he should go?
I think the president should go, and I think the president should go to China with a proposal to China that's specific. I believe he can get an agreement with China. I believe that will leverage Copenhagen to a political agreement where the nations come together, and I think the president can be critical to helping deliver that, as can we in the Senate. And Senator Graham and Senator Lieberman and I are intent on trying to get the framework of a proposal together so that we know what the Senate outlines of a debate will be, and we can go to Copenhagen and help that process.
Let's talk about health care for a second. I talked to one of your colleagues the other day who's planning to vote for whatever health care bill comes out of the process, but who said, this is a tough vote and we're going to take some political flack for it because we're going to raise people's insurance premiums. What about that? Is that a problem for your members? Are you guys going to pay a price next year?
Well, it is a problem right now, but it's a problem that I hope can be addressed, and I think other colleagues believe that too. We are working on the affordability issues with respect to this bill. It's currently being evaluated by the Congressional Budget Office. We need to get those numbers back so then we can look at it and see if we need to adjust and be a little more flexible about how we're approaching it. But I think it's a problem for anybody. It's a problem for me. I don't want to turn around and say to people, we're going to make health care more affordable in America and we're going to improve the system, and all of a sudden they see prices going up beyond what they're going to go up anyway.
So is the answer more subsidies?
It's very important to understand. Health care premiums are going to go up no matter what we do. They're going to go up next year. They've been going up at 28 and 40 and 50 and 100% for some people. What we're trying to do is slow down that increase. But obviously, whenever you take a tough vote that's a responsible vote around here, and there's a lag between the beneficial effect being felt and the time the vote is taken, people are a little at risk.
How do you moderate insurance premiums? Is it with subsidies or is it with regulation? How do you prevent them from going up?
It's a combination. It's absolutely a combination. We have a subsidy structure that comes in to help reduce the cost for individuals who can't afford it on a certain scale, and that scale is yet to be finalized. and we have insurance regulatory reforms that hopefully tampen down the proclivity of those companies to keep raising rates at the speed that they have. And it's the combination of those that need to begin to take hold and produce the beneficial effects.
Do you think it's important, because of the effects on bending the cost curve over time, to preserve the tax on high-value insurance plans as opposed to the approach the House has taken of taxing high-dollar incomes over $1 million?
You know, there are a number of different ways to pay for the bill, and different people will have different thoughts about how to do it. My own predisposition is to keep the component of the high-cost plans at a high enough threshold that you're not pushing it down onto people and giving them a sense that they're being unfairly hurt here. But at the higher level, that will create pressure within the industry in a competitive world to hold those premiums down because they want to be competitive. And so I think it's one of the things that can actually bend the cost curve, and that's why I would argue we ought to try to keep it.
The public option is one of the flashpoints in the debate, as you know. The administration has indicated that they're willing to accept the trigger idea that Olympia Snowe, your colleague, has embraced. And there's a lot of concern out there about big government. Should liberals in your party be prepared to accept that trigger in lieu of pressing for that vigorous, robust public option from day one in order to get this thing through, especially since the White House says they want Republican support?
Well, let's begin at the beginning here. First, the so-called public option that is on the table is not what a lot of Americans think it is when they hear the word public option. It's not like Medicare. It's not a great big public plan like that you can sort of come in and the government's going to offer you this insurance. It's not free. It only applies to a very small percentage of Americans who would be eligible for that. And that's about 15% total, and only about 5%, whatever, of those are going to take it. So you're talking about a very small component of people being affected by a plan that is called public plan, but number one, requires all of the premiums to be paid by the individual and has no public dollars in it except in the first year of startup. It has to be self-sustaining, and it has to operate by the same rules as the private plans. So we shouldn't get hung up over this, quote, debate about the public option. It's a far cry less than what many of us believe ought to be debated as a matter of a public option. Second, we shouldn't shy away from a debate about a public plan. Let's have the debate. We should even have a debate about a single-payer plan if people want to have it. And take the votes and let people's votes stand for the record of what's achievable here and what is not achievable here. And that's the way you arrive at a consensus about a fallback position.
In your view, is the trigger that
trigger
Olympia
is
Snowe's
a
talked
fallback
about,
position.
is that the maximum achievable in this Congress?
The trigger is a fallback position, and I'm not prepared to say until we have the debate and see where the votes are what's achievable yet. I think you've got to, let's engage in that without fear. It's a great debate, and we'll decide what the Senate is willing to do. If you can't get it done, John, I happen to be prepared. I mean, as Olympia and I have worked on this actually together. I think you need some kind of a fallback option at the back end of this, so that we don't lose this opportunity to cement in place a plan B in the event of failure. That's what we talked about doing in 1993-94 when I worked back then with Bill Bradley and Pat Moynihan, Bob Packwood, Bob Dole, a whole group of people on an alternative that would have been a backup to the Clinton plan. And had they been willing to accept that back then, we would have had 97% of all Americans covered back in 2003. That's why those kinds of fallback things, I think, are very worthwhile. And I think the Senate needs to just go seriatim. Step one, step two, step three, and we'll see where we are.
And the timing of that process, Leader Reid seemed to suggest the other day it might kick over into next year. In your view, is that possible, or is it important, as the White House has said, to act this year?
Well, I think it's important to act this year, and I'd like to see us act this year. But everything has obviously been pushed back a little bit here. Even the energy jobs bill has been pushed back.
So do you think it will bleed into next year?
I can't tell you that. No, I would hope not, but I can't sit here in a vacuum today and tell you that because we don't have it back from the Congressional Budget Office, and we haven't started the debate. And we've got to see, it sort of has a life of its own. You kind of have to feel where the tolerance levels are. I think it'd be wonderful if we could finish it before Christmas, and I think we ought to try.
One question about financial regulation before I go to Afghanistan. Your Massachusetts colleague, Barney Frank, has got a financial regulation proposal that would preserve some of the existing regulatory structure, not have as radical a consolidation as your friend Chris Dodd of Connecticut is exploring in the Senate. Who's right in that debate?
Well, I haven't totally engaged completely in the two bills because I've been so busy on these other issues. I think we need a pretty broad transformation here. Chris represents banking industry, and he represents, I think, the combination of both banks and insurance, that if he's calling for a broader reform, I'd want to look at that very, very carefully. Now, Barney is as smart as they come. He's as capable as they come. I haven't had a chance to talk to him about the reasons he's landed where he has, and I clearly will. So, these are very, very capable, both of them, very capable legislators.
But it sounds like your instinct is that something perhaps more far-reaching than the administration proposed that vests less power in the Fed, which is Chris Dodd's point.
I really want to study it. I don't want to shoot from the hip on that one. The consequences are too important to all of us, and I want to look at it very carefully.
Afghanistan, you've obviously played a big role in that issue lately. We all remember you got in a little bit of hot water in your campaign for supplemental troop funding. I was for it before, I was against it. Now some of your colleagues are likely to face a vote on a supplemental funding bill for the war in Afghanistan. What's going to happen there? Is that a real bound on what the administration can do, or are your members at the end of the day going to give the White House whatever they want?
Well, first of all, just as a matter of the record, I got in trouble not because of the substance of it, but because of the way I phrased it.
Fair enough, yeah.
And it was an inadequate, awkward phrasing, and I paid a price for that. But the gist of what I did was correct, which was make a judgment that if certain requisites weren't met in a bill, as you legislate, you have the right to say, I'm not going to support this. And I framed it that way. Who knows? I think our colleagues are looking at this very, very carefully. For all the obvious reasons. They don't want to dig a hole for our country. They don't want young Americans called on to go into combat for a strategy that can't succeed because the underlying assumptions are wrong. And those are the appropriate tests to be applying to this for the Commander-in-Chief, the President, and for us. We have to fund it. And we share a responsibility in the conduct of foreign affairs and war.
So he'll get what he asked for.
Well, I think people will look at it very carefully. I think it'd be very hard to imagine that if the president, after all of this review, and the generals after their review and request, that the Congress is going to somehow come out differently. It doesn't mean there won't be dissenters, and it doesn't mean there won't be a debate, but in the end, I believe the Congress will, providing the strategy makes sense and people can see a path to success, and I suspect he'll choose one where you can, I think Congress will support that.
You were involved in brokering the runoff or getting Hamid Karzai to agree to a runoff. Now that has gone away. How does that, in your view, change your conception of Afghanistan as a partner for the United States, the timing and substance of the president's troop decision?
Well, it doesn't change mine at all because really this was anticipatable and I thought would probably be the way it would turn out. We had a number of very bad options staring us in the face. I think the option of actually having the election though it was up to Afghans as to whether we did or not. We were entirely prepared to do it. But had they done it, I could easily have foreseen the very same arguments being made about that election as were made about the first election, and that would have been devastating to any potential for credibility of the government. So in fact, Dr. Abdullah's withdrawal, inadequate as it is to the complete legitimization of President Karzai, puts him in a position to legitimize himself over the course of these next days, a place we might not have been without Dr. Abdullah getting out. So it's really up to President Karzai, and it's up to us together. And when I say us, I don't just mean the United States. I mean the ISAF forces, the NATO countries, to come together around a strategy for success, not just in Afghanistan, but regionally, and then pursue it with vigor.
40,000 more troops sound about right to you?
As I said at the Council on Foreign Relations, I thought that without an adequate formula for how we're going to get the governance and the development components, the civilian sector of these things, at the same rate as the military, and we don't have that yet, I think 40,000 pushes too far, too fast. And those are the words I used at the Council on Foreign Relations. 10,000 of those also represent making up for the Canadian and Dutch leaving, some at the end of next year and some the year beyond. I think we ought to push back against that. If this is indeed a NATO priority, if this is a global threat, then I think we ought to push back against countries sort of dumping on the United States the additional need to provide for those troops. So
is it your sense that the
I think
president's
that the
coming
president,
to agree with you?
I can't tell you that, but I do think that some troops are appropriate, providing the mission is clearly defined and the path to success is buttressed by adequate governance and adequate development capacity.
When I interviewed President Obama a couple of weeks ago and asked him about the warnings he was getting from some colleagues about a quagmire like Vietnam, he said, Afghanistan is not Vietnam. You never walk into the same river twice. Do you see echoes of Vietnam in the Afghanistan war?
Well, you know something, John, I work very hard not to be imprisoned by the Vietnam experience. Informed by it, but not imprisoned by it. And so not everything is Vietnam. When you see things, you know, you have to really push back against some of the analogies. Are there some echoes? Yes, of course there are some echoes. When you have young Americans marching around in another country with guns and full battle gear, in a place they don't speak the language, in a place they don't share the culture, they don't share the religion, and they look differently, you bet there are echoes. And when you see people staring in the way that they stare at a foreign force walking around, telling them where they can go and can't go and what they can do and so forth, it has an impact. But that doesn't make Afghanistan Vietnam at all. We went there. The underlying assumptions of Vietnam, in my judgment, were absolutely incorrect. The underlying assumption that brought us to Afghanistan was clearly correct. We went there to kick al-Qaeda out, hopefully to have captured and killed Osama bin Laden and his cohorts, a huge failing, incidentally, in strategy. But without going back to that, we went there with a legitimate concern. Al-Qaeda kicking it out, Taliban who were harboring them. They're not there now. I mean, Taliban's there, but Al-Qaeda is not. And so we have to sort of ask ourselves, are we staying in the correct way? We know we went there in the correct way. Are we staying there? And I think that's a much tougher judgment given the real threat of Pakistan, the threat of the regional instability, and the fact that if Afghanistan weren't next door to Pakistan, we almost certainly wouldn't be there.
Two things very quickly before I let you go. You're in the middle of a lot of big stuff right now, but you're not president, which you want it to be. How tough is it for you to reflect, as I imagine you do from time to time, a few thousand votes in Ohio had gone the other way, I'd be sitting there making these calls?
You know, I am long past that kind of, just long past that kind of reflection. And it would be a stupid waste of time for me to sit around and engage in that. There's too much to do, number one, and it's a silly indulgence. I worked hard for President Obama to be president. I'm glad he's president. I think he's put the country on the right track. There are tough decisions yet to be made. I don't agree with absolutely everything, but I really believe he has changed the direction for the better and is making a lot of tough decisions correctly. So I'm very liberated and content to be representing the people of Massachusetts in what Ted Kennedy always said was the greatest privilege of his life. It's the greatest privilege of my life. And I love what I'm doing right now. And so I'm just going to keep on doing it.
Last question. John McCain took a lot of flack for his choice of Sarah Palin. A lot of people thought it was a mistake. Democrats certainly made that argument, not so much Republicans. You picked John Edwards, and we've learned since that campaign about a pretty sordid story involving his family, tragic story really. When you reflect on that story, does that tell you that you made the wrong decision in John Edwards?
Well, everybody in the country will make their own decision about that choice at that point in time. What's happened since has obviously been deeply troubling to everybody. It's a very tragic, situation. I don't know how to describe it otherwise. And I think it speaks for itself. I don't think any of us have to sit here and start making retro judgments that don't take anybody anywhere. I feel very, very badly for the family, for all of them, and I think the rest of it just sort of speaks for itself.
But a lot of Democrats have said, wow, he could have been our nominee, and then that could have come out. Do you ever think he could have been vice president?
That all happened subsequent to any of our vetting process or any of our relationship. So what might have been in 2008 is different from what was in 2004. Nevertheless, obviously, we all have to make our reflections about what has happened since. And I have said, I think it's a tragedy, and I think it speaks for itself.
Senator Kerry, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thank you.